All right, so today is this is really our second lecture. So we had a lecture that was sort of an introduction to Native American culture and Native American tribes. Um, this is our second lecture, so there will be a quiz tonight. Okay, this is only, I think tonight's is a 15-question quiz. It's a little bit shorter because there's a little less information in the PowerPoint. What we're going to be looking at today is really early Native American conflict with whites, right? So we're looking at Native American wars prior to the 19th century, meaning prior to 1800. So really we're talking about, honestly, we're going to go prior to 1776 here. Right, so we're actually only looking at Native American skirmishes as it pertains to like British and colonials, not actual American history once America becomes a place, right? So we will start with the Pequot War. Okay? This is one of the earliest examples, or one of our earliest conflicts with natives. This happens up in the New England area, and like when I say conflicts, I really mean sort of full-on war, right? There's conflicts. I think I told you. I hope I told you that even as English people or as Europeans were coming and fishing off the east coast of what is the United States now, right? Sometimes there would be small sort of skirmishes. We know what a skirmish is. It's like a battle with like two people, right? Like it's like a very, very small fight. Okay? A skirmish would not be a part of a war. There were skirmishes that happened, right? Where maybe a colonist killed a native, right? Or vice versa. The Pequot War is one of our early examples of sort of a full-on war in which Native Americans are actively fighting English colonists. Okay, this happens really as a direct result of the murder of two English colonists, and then sort of the subsequent expectations or the subsequent behaviors. Right, so the English are actually asking for the murderers to be turned over. The Pequot essentially say, like, we don't know who the murderers are, we can't prove who the murderers are, and even if we could, they're outside of our jurisdiction, right? Do we know what jurisdiction means? No. So jurisdiction is just your area of control, okay? So if let's just pretend for the sake of argument here, right? We are a Native American tribe, and I am the chief. Okay? Because we are a tribe and there's a hierarchical structure. You will do what I say, yes? Okay? Therefore, I have some level of control or jurisdiction over you. If you were to break some sort of law, rule, custom, whatever words you want to use, right? I could ensure that you were punished for that behavior, right? Conversely, I cannot punish somebody sitting in Ms. Brenner's A-push class. Right? That's outside of my jurisdiction. Okay? The Pequot actually try to get alliances amongst other Native American tribes, and they fail. The Narragansett specifically are the ones that they're a fairly large tribe in the New England area. They are the ones that the Pequots try to get to aid them, to help them, to form some sort of military alliance. And the Narragansett don't side with the Pequot. They're going to side with the English with sort of the hope, because these tribes had fights in the past, right? So this kind of goes to that concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Except the enemy of my enemy isn't really my friend when you consider that you have basically three groups now in this scenario. We have the English, we have the Narragansett, and we have the Pequot. They're all fighting for territory, right, for control. And in fact, the Pequot are smart enough to go to the Narragansett and basically tell them, hey, if you side with the English, the English will eventually do to you what they are doing to us now. Like, they will turn on you, they will take your land, and you will have no allies to help you. Which seems pretty prophetic, yes? Right? But you have to understand that Native American tribes, although it would seem would have a reason to align with one another and fight off white settlers, they typically do not. Okay? We all know what Thanksgiving is, yes? Right? It's part of pop culture, right? The Native Americans came and provided us with corn and squash and pumpkins, and we didn't starve to death. Yay, white people made it in the New World, right? Okay? There are some aspects of Thanksgiving that are not nearly as positive. One of them comes out of this war. I don't remember the leader of the colony at the time that declares it. It might have been Winthrop. I wouldn't test you on that. I don't care. That's trivia. But there is a battle, right? The Pequot are pretty much annihilated in that battle. The English return and they declare a day of Thanksgiving for the safety of the settlers, of the white folk, right? I mean, if you think about it, a day of Thanksgiving is simply rejoicing for something positive that happened, right? That's sort of the definition of it. Okay. After all of this fighting, and it occurs sporadically over these 2 years, I need you to understand that it's not constant warfare over these 2 years, right? The fighting occurs sporadically. The Pequot, after they're pretty much close to annihilation, right? They're going to have to flee the sort of Massachusetts, New England, in fact, a lot of this occurs, I think, in Rhode Island, right? So if you look at my map up here, Rhode Island is sort of east of Connecticut, south of Massachusetts, right? Very, very, very small state right there. As the Pequot are destroyed and eliminated, they basically run to the Mohawks, who are part of the Iroquois, and they're looking for, what's the word? Asylum, sanctuary. Sanctuary would be a good word, right? Sanctuary, asylum. They're looking essentially to be swallowed up by the Mohawks, right? We sort of live with them, become a part of their culture, because they've lost. The Mohawks instead kill Sassacus, who's the chief of the Pequot at the time, and like turn his head over to white people, and that's the end of the Pequots. Like, period. They're done.
So like, what happens to a tribe after that? Like, I know you say like they're done, but like.
So for the Pequot specifically, they're actually outlawed from using that name anymore, right? But outlawing speech is really hard because people can kind of say whatever they want. It's really hard to hold people accountable. There are some instances like that tribal name pops up in history later, even though it's supposed to be dead. Like the tribal name is supposed to be dead. But part of what happened is the very beginning of this, as the Pequot are trying to gain allies, they actually split, right? And so the Pequot become one group, and then the Mohegans become the other. Okay, so this is the other problem with Native American history, right? One, there's no standard spelling of stuff, right? And then two, because when we go back to that from the first PowerPoint, right? We have the bands, the clans, and the nations, yes? Right? Those alliances are shifting rather frequently, right? In which case, you have bands that have a name that are part of a larger tribe that is a nation, and then sometimes they splinter off. So what happens, though, with the Pequot that survive, and most of them do not survive, those that survive are essentially, they become slaves. Okay? Now, white folks sort of realize that they can't, there's a couple of instances where they give them to farmers, but I don't, in fact, if you ever get a question about that, that's not what happens. Okay? they either go to Native American tribes, right, who can enslave other Native Americans because they can just do it, right? They know the land is equally as well, right? They have the alliances, whatnot. Okay? Or they're sold into slavery down into the Caribbean islands, right? So you understand the concept of the spoils of war? Do we know what that means? So if you win a war, right, you get the riches of the other country. Okay? This is one of the reasons why America is stupid, right? Because we kept going to war in the Middle East and we don't own any of the oil there, right? Like, that's stupid. If you're going to go to war, take the resources after you win, okay? That's what the spoils of war are, right? People fight wars over resources, meaning over land, water, gold, whatever, right? Nobody fights a war, wins a war, and then goes, hey, you can have your stuff back, dude. That's stupid, right? Why else did you sacrifice your own people if not for some sort of gain? Okay? So, some of those people that are still alive become slaves of Native American tribes that allied with the British, with the colonials. Others are sold down to Bermuda, Hispaniola, I think. Regardless, they go to the Caribbean islands. Okay? In fact, the successful enslavement of Native Americans in what is currently the United States occurs when those natives are sold to Caribbean island nations. Okay? Because that way they're on an island, there's nowhere to run to. They don't have allies or other bands or clans that they had some familial connection with in order to aid one another. All right? So this brings us to King Philip's War. Right? This is the next sort of major conflict that occurs. Sometimes it's also called the Great Narragansett War. Again, this is the New England area. In fact, all of our wars, no, not all of them, most of them are being fought up in the New England area. But Metacomet is that's actually a rendition of him, right? So that's a picture painting. It is not created, to understand, this is not a primary source. This was not created in 1675. It's a reproduction a couple centuries later of what he was supposed to look like. Okay, he is the son, and I always feel like I butcher these names, of Massasoit, who was the first dude to really engage the Pilgrims, right? So this is the Wampanoag tribe, which is like Massachusetts, right? Specifically coastal eastern Massachusetts, right? This is a very large tribe. It's made up of smaller tribes, okay? So this is more like the concept of the Confederacy that we talk about, right? This is a nation rather than like bands of tribes. Yes? We understand that? Okay. So, they are the initial interaction between this is the initial interaction between whites, Pilgrims. Let's go Pilgrims, because obviously Jamestown's in Virginia, they're first, right? Pilgrims and Native Americans, it is the Wampanoag tribe that is first, right? They develop good relations, right? There's a positive alliance between the two. Metacomet takes over after his dad dies, and he engages in warfare, right? Like, we're gonna have King Philip's War, which is ultimately the bloodiest. It's actually the bloodiest of pretty much all. It might be, like, in terms of casualty rates, it might be the worst of all wars that Americans or that's ever been fought in America. Okay? When you're talking a casualty rate, you're talking a casualty rate that exceeds 50%. Okay? And just so we're clear, so we understand, do you know what casualty means? Tyler, what's it mean? No. That's the problem, right? That you can be a casualty of war and live, right? If you lose an arm, you are a casualty of war. Right, yeah, so casualties are really anybody that is killed or wounded in action. Okay? Those would be considered casualties of war because you're no longer sort of whole or normal. I mean, you don't even have to lose a limb. Like, if you just get shot, right, like you are a casualty of the war because you are now out of the war effort for, at the very least, however long it takes you to heal from that bullet wound, right? So you're looking at... I don't know, when you're talking strength, I want to say for the English like actual combatants, right? Not like women and children, right? English actual combatants was close to 75% casualties, right? And then I think the Wampanoag was like about 60% in terms of casualties. Now, I do need you to understand these are estimates, right? Again, I would never test you on this, especially not with like, oh, the casualty rate was 62%, 64%, 68%, or 70%, because there's no way of knowing. Okay, we're not 100% certain. You have really at this time you have militias that are doing the fighting, right? And we'll eventually get into the difference when we get to like white settlement and culture and the American Revolution and all that stuff. The difference between an army and a militia. Right, because they're wildly different. Okay, so this is the Wampanoag tribe. Here's sort of what happens, right? Disease, smaller skirmishes, a sort of general fight over resources has led to a significant decrease in the strength of the tribe. And so there's sort of a belief that Metacomet believes that it's sort of unsustainable, that at some point in time they're going to have to fight, and so he would rather fight while he still has at least some amount of force, right? Especially since the English are bringing in more people from Europe at regular intervals, and natives are dying from disease at regular intervals, right? So by the middle of the 1600s, we see sort of an inverse correlation to the population of these two groups, right? Native American population is decreasing, and white population is increasing. Eventually, what Metacomet believes is that he's going to run out of sort of people capable of fighting a war, and then they're done, right? They're going to continue sort of a process called appeasement. Anybody know what that means? Abby, what's appeasement?
When you give somebody something to win war.
Yeah, that's a perfect definition, right? You're continuing to give somebody something in order to maintain the peace, right? But eventually, if you continue to give and give and give and give and give, what happens? You have nothing left. Right, and now you're just gone. You're dead. You're done. Okay. Other problems that led to it, right? The free range of livestock. Okay. I don't know if you're aware of this, but like cattle fields, right, that are fenced in, doesn't exist at this point, right? In fact, it won't exist until like the Civil War. Okay. So you mark your livestock, right? Like you nip the ear of the pig, or you brand your cattle, or you do something, right? That marks your livestock as yours, and then you basically turn them loose in the countryside, and they just wander around and they eat whatever, right? So what does that do to the three sisters? Squash, corn, and beans. Yeah, the livestock is running through there, eating it, destroying crops. So if you're growing food, right? If I'm growing food, right, and Aaron's got livestock that's trampling through my field, do I have a problem with him? Yeah, like that's going to create tension. Okay, religion becomes an issue. Okay, this is more of an issue. Well, it depends where you're at in the New England area. In a couple of places in New England, they're going to live and let live. Okay? Other places in New England are just so arrogant that they're right about God and life and everything that they want to force everybody into their religion. Like, force. Okay? Which, obviously, there's a lot of resistance amongst the Native Americans. That really comes to a head here with John Sassamon, who is a Christian convert, right? That's why he's got a Christian name now, John. Okay? And he works as an interpreter between the English and the Indians. And guess what the English think? Or sorry, guess what the Indians think? He's a traitor. He's a spy. They actually call him a spy. Right? And so he's murdered. Right? 3 Native Americans murder him. And so what do the English do? They hang the murderers. And which gets into a really interesting concept in terms of like jurisdiction and powers of punishment and things like that. Do you understand that? Right? Because if a Canadian citizen were to come down here, right, and I were to murder that Canadian citizen, can Canada execute me?
No. Yes.
No, not really. Now here's the thing. There like once you really get like next year when you get into politics and you understand politics, there are countries that have agreements, right? Like if I'm in England and I murder somebody in England and then I run back to the United States and England has all this evidence about me, like that I did it, right? Like they've got like video evidence of me stabbing somebody in London, right? They can go to the United States and be like, hey, we want this dude back, and the U.S. will be like, all right, man. Right? Or the U.S. will be like, okay, fine, we'll put him on trial here, and we'll punish him here. Right? But there's an agreement there. Just free advice. If you ever murder somebody, you know where to go, right?
Where?
Mexico. They ain't sending you back. There's no, it's actually called a SOFA, which is a Statute of Forces Agreement. You don't need to know this for a test. You don't need to know this probably ever. Right? But a Statute of Forces Agreement is simply an agreement amongst nations as to like, how to handle legal issues involving foreign nationals, right? Now, that doesn't mean Mexico won't send you back. Like, sometimes they do. They send back the little affluenza team, right? But they don't have to send you back because there's no agreement between the Mexican government and the American government, right? And if you don't know who the affluenza team is, just look that up on your own time because that's some fun stuff. If I get through this fast enough, I'll tell you. All right, this brings us to the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is the singularly most important conflict in colonial America. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different tribes that get involved in this, even all the way down to like the Cherokee, who honestly, like you can't even find the Cherokee on this map because the Cherokee are like down here. Right? But the Cherokee and Iroquois hated each other. They've been fighting for a long time because they're 2 of the more prominent, more powerful Native American tribes along the East Coast, right? Or along what we would sort of consider the East Coast now, right? So yeah, Appalachians and East. They're 2 of the largest, biggest tribes. And so the French and Indian War is really the French and the Indians against the British and the colonials, and like 1 or 2. Indian tribes. Like 1 or 2 Indian tribes are going to side with the British. Okay? A lot of them side with the French because most of this conflict is going to occur in what we call the Ohio River Valley area, right? And so you can see the Ohio River here, right? The Ohio River Valley is really this area through here. It's pretty fertile land, even though it's a little cold up there. But there was a lot of commerce that occurred in that general area. Hopefully you recognize, based on that map, you see where Lake Ontario is. That's like Iroquois territory, right? Like that's the Iroquois were prominent over there. The Iroquois had been engaged in commerce with the French for a long time. right? Because there's a significant difference. There's a significant difference in how the French come to the New World and how the English come to the New World, right? The English come to the New World and they set up colonies. They set up Plymouth. They set up Jamestown. Like, they're bringing people over here and they're creating communities and villages and towns and eventually, like, states and eventually a nation. The French aren't doing that, right? The French are coming down the St. Lawrence River, right, which is up here, right? So this is the St. Lawrence River. They're coming down the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes region, right? And it's a very small number of French, and pretty much just dudes, okay? They're coming there to engage in commerce. They're traders. They're trappers. They're looking for fur, right? They trade with the Iroquois. They trade with the other Native American tribes in that area, and then they sort of leave, right? They set up forts, right? Like, you see forts all out there. But forts, really, at this point, are honestly more trading posts than they are military in nature. Okay? That doesn't mean you don't have, like, a French army there. Okay? But it's a very small force, and for the most part, the French actually have really positive relations with the Native Americans, and we'll talk about that with the last one, with Pontiac's Rebellion, here in a second. Okay? I think I told you, or maybe I told you already, the French and Indian War is really a part of a larger conflict called the 7 Years' War. That's Winston Churchill on the slide. Winston Churchill is like the Prime Minister of England during World War II, right? But Churchill is like a history buff. Dude loves history. He calls the 7 Years' War the First World War, right? Because the French and the English are engaged in conflicts all over the globe, right? Yes, they're fighting in North America, but they're also fighting, like, you have the British East India Trading Company and the French India Trading Company. They're fighting in India, right? They're fighting in Latin America. They're fighting in Europe. They're fighting all over the world, really for, like, dominance, right? And ultimately, the British are going to be successful because the British have the largest, they have the better navy, right? So when we look at some of the actual conflicts that occurred within the French and Indian War, the first one is Braddock's expedition. Right? And Braddock's expedition is kind of fascinating. There's a little bit of a who's who in the American Revolution that are a part of this conflict. In fact, a lot of the prominent military leaders on both sides of the American Revolution really cut their teeth here in the French and Indian War. Right? George Washington being one of them. Right? Washington is leading colonial troops, colonial irregulars, all the way up from Virginia, in order to help fight the French and Indian War, because Virginia wants access to the Ohio River Valley, right? Horatio Gates, Daniel Boone, and then Thomas Gage are others, right? Gage eventually becomes, I think Gage eventually will become like the commander of all British forces during the Revolutionary War, right? Like, he's a massive military leader. Braddock is the one that's in charge when this happens. Braddock is trying to move his forces essentially from Philadelphia up into what the British call Fort Necessity, right? That the French call Fort Duquesne. It's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Okay? So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is fairly significant because Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is where three rivers meet. Right? The Monongahela River, the Ohio River, and the Allegheny River, right, meet in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then the Ohio comes out of that and goes down, like, between Ohio and West Virginia and then down into the Mississippi, right? So you can actually, like, get on a boat today, you could get on a boat in New Orleans and go to Pittsburgh. Right? Right? Waterways are extremely important. One of the things that Braddock does, Braddock's actually fairly smart in this regard. Right? We're talking about the woodlands of Pennsylvania, right? There's just trees everywhere. That makes it really hard to move armies and to move supplies. Braddock's going to create a road. Okay? He's going to create a road to try to aid in the movement. Now, the problem with that is, now as Braddock's doing this, he's separated his own forces, right? Because he's got people up ahead trying to clear the way for the road, and then he's got his real, like, supplies, like the big wagons and whatnot, bringing up the rear. Eventually, sort of south of Pittsburgh, right, Braddock's army is crossing the Monongahela River, and they get ambushed. And I'm going to use the word ambush because that's what the British claim. The French do not claim that it's an ambush. Okay? Now, it's important for you to understand when I say ambush, like, do we understand how people fought wars back then? It was the dumbest thing in, like, the history of mankind, right? Europeans were the dumbest thing in the history of mankind. Like, literally, the British would stand here on a field, in an open field. They would all line up and they would stand here, and the French would stand on that side, and then the British would, like, point their guns at them and shoot. And then they would stand there, and this is back when you had, like, muskets, right? So you had to pour some gunpowder into the barrel of the weapon, and then you had the little ball, right? And then you had, like, a ramrod, and you had to jam the ball down to the base, right? And then you had to put a little gunpowder on, like, the flint where the hammer comes down. It took, like, a minute to reload a gun to fire one shot. And they would just stand there across from the French while the French shot at them. Right? But that's like manliness. Man, that's a man fight. It's stupid. Okay? So, one, if the British were ambushed, like that, an ambush is basically a surprise attack, right? Like it's a little dishonorable, right? One side is already on the field of battle, ready to fight. The other side just got there and they weren't ready yet. Like, you gotta wait for them to get ready. Okay, so ambushes are kind of suspect. Here's the thing. We actually have evidence from the French, like French reports of this battle. They wanted to set an ambush because the French were fighting with the Indians, and that's the way the Indians fought, right? But the French were late. They had scouts saying, like, oh, Braddock's army is going to cross the Monongahela here. They're running to get in position for the ambush when they see Braddock's army and the army's already crossed, right? But then what ends up happening, because I told you his army's very spread out, right? There's gunfire. And so now, like, Braddock's trying to get the rest of his army up, and the people that were up are retreating, and they're, like, running into each other, and it's just mass chaos. And Braddock gets shot, and he eventually dies, because Braddock's an idiot.
So they were ambushed by the French?
Not really ambushed. The French were trying to ambush them because the French were better friends with the Native Americans. They understood the Native American way of fighting, which is guerrilla warfare. Now, you're going to read, in fact, I think it's your reading for tomorrow, is about Robert Rogers, who basically is the father of, like, American Special Forces, right? So, like, if you know what the Army Rangers are, like, that's Robert Rogers. Like, this dude dresses white folk up in Indian garments and Indian attire, and they travel like Indians, and they move through the woods like Indians, and they'll pop up, they'll shoot you, they'll hit the ground, take off running, like it's not a real battle. Okay? You inflict much better casualties there, but the term is called guerrilla warfare, right? That's what guerrilla warfare is. We're not going to just meet on a battlefield where you get to shoot at me and then I shoot at you, because that's stupid, right? Instead, we're going to hide behind trees, behind rocks, we're going to, like, pop up, shoot at you, and then run away. Right? Because if it takes me a minute to reload my gun, that's a minute for you to shoot back at me. But if I just jump up, fire once, and run away, you probably don't even have time to, like, figure out where the shot came from before I'm 200 yards away and I'm gone. Alright? So there's a couple of other battles, and I'm going to have to move a little bit quicker because I'm running out of time. Fort Duquesne, the French are very significant. The French are winning the French and Indian War initially. And then there's a dude named William Pitt who takes over, like, politically. He takes over in England, and he's going to control the war here. And his idea in the 7 Years' War is like, we got to win America. Got to win America. Got to win America. And so Pitt's going to bring a whole bunch more forces, and ultimately they're going to be able to do that. And it is important for you to understand the proclamation line of 1763. This is actually an outcome of the war. So the British, because they had Native American allies, right? They basically say, look, man, here's the boundaries of the British colony. You cannot exceed that. The problem is, like, by this point, because we're talking about 1763 now, right? We're talking about 150 years of white folk coming over across the Atlantic Ocean. Like, the population has expanded significantly, and we'll get into this at least a little bit, right? Like, all of the land is pretty much already owned, because you've got people that own thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, right? Like, they own thousands of acres because they took advantage of systems early on that allowed them to get all of that land. So that means that the people coming over later, there's no land for them to have. They need to continue to move further west. The proclamation line tells them that they're supposed to stop that. They don't stop. They don't. They're not going to listen, right? White colonists don't listen. But initially, like the only people that were allowed to cross that line were licensed traders, right? Meaning people that actually had a license to cross that line and go trade with the Native Americans for furs and things like that. Okay? As a result of the French and Indian War, France loses a whole bunch of territory, right? Basically everything east of the Mississippi is gone. Okay? They still have everything west of the Mississippi. Well, they have what they think they have west of the Mississippi. What's west of the Mississippi is still very unexplored at this point, and a whole bunch of people are claiming a whole bunch of the same area. And there's really no white folk in any of that area anyways yet at this point. Okay. The reality is the big losers of the French and Indian War are the Native Americans. Yes, the French lost, but the Native Americans lose like big time, right? Because any Native American group that sided with the French is obviously on the losing side. And even those like the Cherokee who side with the British, the colonists then continue to push out into Cherokee land, right? So this brings us to Pontiac's Rebellion, which occurs, again, you saw the proclamation line of 1763, right? Basically right after the war's over, okay? Because white settlers, white Europeans are like, hey, we don't really care, we're going to keep going west. So they're losing land. Right? And so the Ohio River Valley Native Americans, those natives in that area, are concerned about their loss of land and their loss of territory. They're also very concerned about like British behaviors. The French had dominated this area. The French were also really awesome in understanding Native American culture, right? Like Native American culture is, on some level, it's a simplistic culture, right? But there were certain behaviors. Like the French would commonly provide gifts to the chief, right? And so that maintained positive relations. And then it also helped the chief maintain positive relations amongst everybody else, because the chief would get all this stuff, and then he would go out and start passing it out to his people, right? So everybody's benefiting from this. The French provide Native Americans with guns, gunpowder, all sorts of technology that makes it easier for them to hunt, easier for them to sustain their way of life. The British take over and like, gifts? Not doing that. That's a waste of time and money. Well, now you've insulted the Native Americans, right? And you've made it harder for the chief to tell his people, like, hey, be good to these people because they're helping us. Well, they're not helping anymore, right? And Pontiac, there's some disagreement in terms of, like, how significant Pontiac's war is, or even how much it's really Pontiac's war, right? Pontiac was simply one Native American chief. There's a whole bunch of tribes that are involved in this that are basically going to try to overtake or take over a whole bunch of forts out in the wilderness here, right? Out on the frontier. They end up getting, I think, 10. Right? They end up getting 10 forts. But ultimately, it's sort of a political stalemate or military stalemate. Nobody really wins. Nothing really changes. People die essentially for very, very little, right? I do want to call your attention at least to Fort Pitt, right? So Fort Pitt is here. This is one of the examples. We actually have like written evidence of biological warfare being used at Fort Pitt, where they're providing the smallpox blankets, right? There's some historical disagreement as to how effective that biological warfare was, because there didn't seem to be a really high, infection rate amongst the natives that got the diseased blankets and handkerchiefs, right? So by this point, smallpox had worked its way through North America, and so they might have already had some immunity to it. Right, there might just be some poor documentation as a result of it, right? But basically, this creates bad blood in that area. There's continued skirmishes, right? You hit me, so I've got to hit you, but then I hit you, so you have to hit me, right? And we get to this point where we're just like slapping each other around. Both sides are going around killing women and children. Right, Native American groups are attacking frontier settlements right? Burning houses, burning settlements to the ground. The Paxton Boys were in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, right? Like they're just going up and basically rounding up and murdering Indians, right? Like it's a very barbaric period, right? Where we're engaged in very, very negative behaviors, right? We're fighting with one another all the time, and there's sort of no end in sight initially, because it almost gets to the point where like we don't really know who started it, right? Some of those, if we go back, some of those early forts that fell, they weren't even really attacked. They were sort of sieged. You know what a siege is? So it's a military tool or a military strategy where you basically surround an area and then you just sit down, right? And you just wait, right? Because if I surround your fort, what happens? Eventually you run out of food, right? And at that point you're like, well, we're leaving, I'm out. And then you win, and you didn't have to kill nobody, right? Okay, but then is that an attack? I mean, obviously it's not like a violent attack, right? But Native Americans, you should also understand, Native Americans didn't play by the same rules as white folks, right? Like, if you surrendered a fort as a white person, like you waved a little white flag, the other army is supposed to let you take all your stuff and go home. Which, again, I think is stupid, but whatever, right? But they're supposed to, like, let you just march off into the distance and you're fine. Native Americans didn't allow you to do that. Unless they thought you fought honorably. But if they thought you fought, like, dishonorably, like you was a coward, you was a whatever, right? Then they would attack the retreating line and, like, go and scout people because you suck as a fighter. Right? Right? And it's just a difference in culture, right? But that's part of the problem that whites have, especially as it comes to conflict, because there's such a difference in a cultural understanding of even how to wage war at this time. So, on the bright side, I got through everything.